Seidner works in the Executive Office of the President on the United States Office of Management and Budget as the Performance Manager for Federal Human Capital Policy. In that position since 2014, he has worked to reshape the structure of how the civil service works. He is the lead analyst for when the White House needs to determine broad workforce policy decisions and has written numerous official policy documents. In his role, he works with all agencies and aspects of workforce policy. He has almost 20 years of experience working on civil service management policy. Rob has spent the past 10 months on loan to the US Senate working to pass reforms that require changes to law. Today, Rob is talking on behalf of himself and not representing his employers. This is in order to present his opinions that may differ than the official stance of the US government. Once again, thanks a lot, Rob, for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to our participants, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor for me to be able to join you today. One of the best parts of my job is realizing that what I do, I have counterparts in every other country, and truly, like the issues we face, whether I am speaking to a large country or a small local government, we all have the same exact issues when it comes to civil service. How do we hire? How do we manage? How do we compensate? So I always enjoy a lot of these conversations. Um, I've been working with the World Bank, jumping in on calls like this for about 5, 6 years, and I always find I learn as much from them as I'm able to discuss. So for this session, please feel free to just raise your hand and interrupt if you have any questions for me. I want to make sure that I'm discussing stuff that is interesting to you and that you can use in your jobs. What I was asked to discuss was kind of the uniqueness of my role in terms of what am I working on and how do you make change to a civil service system while trying to constantly maintain the fact that in the civil service, we have a far higher threshold that we need to meet than any private sector needs to meet. If we do something wrong, the entire legitimacy of the government is put in doubt. And I think we're all pretty used to the fact that what we do is generally taken for granted. When we're doing our jobs right, nobody really notices. The smallest thing that goes wrong, that gets highlighted quite a lot and can be very damaging. To kind of step back to why the US civil service is really different than a lot of other countries, it's the fact that our civil service, for better or for worse, has its roots in the late 1800s. And where I say for better, it really is the type of change that the United States made as a fairly young country that enabled it to become a superpower very quickly. What a lot of people may not recognize today was in the 1880s, before we had a professional civil service, the US was only about 100 years old, and it was not considered a professionally strong country when you compare to the leading nations of the world then. So if a diplomat was coming from England, France, Russia, it was not considered a particularly good country to come to. Our civil service started in 1883 after we had a president who was assassinated, killed by someone who was looking for a civil service job. Because at that time, any time the president changed, everyone who worked for the government lost their job and would be replaced by political connected people. That meant every, 4 or 8 years, the country was kind of starting over. And more importantly, someone was loyal to the president, to the political party, to something other than the country. So when we started in the 1880s with a professional civil service, it changed that. It meant all of a sudden we had people working for the government who were thinking 10, 20, 30 years into the future and being able to really become experts in what they were doing. So by the 1910s, mere 30 years later, the United States was able to have like an effective defense. We had introduced laws related to unions, labor, food regulation, agriculture, several other areas that I don't think our country would have been able to develop. So that's the good part of having a system that is so ingrained in how our country works that it's almost not questioned. The downside of it is we have a lot of processes that have not been updated since the 1940s. That is very much a problem when you look at how we try to pay people, how we try to place them in positions, how we even think about hiring. Everything else has changed since the 1940s, but trying to maintain a system along those lines just simply is a risk factor for our country. In fact, the main auditing agency for our government, it's called the Government Accountability Office. They have listed federal HR systems as one of the highest risks to our country for more than 20 years. It's that serious that they list this as one of the main places that if our country cannot fix, we are truly at risk of a major failure. And we see this on a very regular basis where someone like me comes in. It's trying to figure out where is that line where we're upholding what we call the merit system here, the idea that it doesn't matter where you came from, what your background is, who you know, and we try to hire fairly with the fact that the types of jobs we're hiring for now are very different than the types of jobs we hired for in the 1940s. It leads to a lot of disagreement, where in the 1940s, 50s, even the 1970s and 1980s, most civil servant jobs in the United States were administrative, they were manual labor, a lot of clerks, a lot of secretaries, a lot of people who had to do the same task over and over. And it was kind of interchangeable work. Now we have a 2.2 million workforce, which is the same number of people we had in the 1950s, but the work is completely different. So back then, as I said, we had a lot of interchangeable work. Now, almost all of the government's work is filled with knowledge workers. The US government hires more doctors, lawyers, business people, technology, cyber, whatever the big issue is, we are the biggest employer of them because the jobs are so unique for all the scientists we need to hire. And that means we're constantly competing with the private sector for people with these skills. So a really great example would be our government's response recently to COVID, that we have government scientists who are amongst the world's smartest elite scientists in the world, and the most they can get paid is, about $180,000, which sounds like a lot of money until you look at the pharmaceutical companies who can hire those same scientists for 4 times that amount of money and give them stock and make significantly more. Same thing with veterinarians who are looking at the entire health of our agriculture system. They get paid maybe 25% of what they could be making if they go to the private sector. For technology, it's an even larger gap. Most of our people in technology, they're making $120,000, which in the US is still a very good salary, except if you compare, we're competing with Google and Apple and IBM and companies that will pay more than $1 million for that talent. So figuring out how to do that balance is very problematic, and we have to try to fix things where we can, recognizing those who are choosing to be civil servants are making a choice. And a lot of the times we will lose our existing employees because of bureaucracy, because of added constraints, and how do we try to work on that. So we have a couple of places that we're able to make the big changes. The first is my normal job, which is, which is mentioned, is within the White House, but I'm on the permanent career staff. So I am there regardless of who the president is. And my job is to be completely, oh, hello? Yes, do you have a question? Did you have a question? I can take it.
Please go ahead. I think it was a mistake. Yeah, please mute yourself.
Okay. So within the White House, we only pick a few very large topics where the idea is getting the senior-most people in government behind those few issues will help drive consistent change and cultural change. So we have an entire Office of Personnel Management, which is responsible for the operations of human resources. For my position, for up until very recently, it was just me. It was my job to try to think of what are the big issues and try to bring all of the different agencies together to work on one issue. So one of the best examples that I know the World Bank has probably spent significant time talking with you about is employee engagement. So that was a topic that, in 2010, nobody in the government had even heard of the term. It really wasn't anything that was being focused on. People didn't understand it. When it did come up, it was kind of laughed at, that, what is this idea of like engaging employees and who cares? But all the research shows that an engaged workforce is more productive, less likely to leave, being able to do significantly more for less because of the intrinsic value that they find in work when they're not being beaten down by the system. So in 2014, I was able to write a letter from the White House. It was called a presidential memorandum that ordered all the agencies to start focusing on this issue. We named a senior person from every single agency we had whose name would be attached to this initiative, that they would take responsibility in their agency. We provided existing data. We created surveys to get ongoing data, and we publicly called out this issue, a lot of media attention, but in a very powerful way, since we only can pick a few things. Anytime one of the leaders of their agencies would be meeting, at the time it was with President Obama, President Obama wanted kind of a one-page sheet of everything that was important going on in that agency that he would be able to ask questions on. The employee engagement score was added to that list. So the secretary, so the head of an agency, knew anytime that they were going in to talk to President Obama was going to be able to say, good job, or what's going on here. So when you have at the top the leadership that we know is very short term, these are people who only stay in their jobs 18 months, 2 years, someone's a long time is like 3 years in one of these jobs. But if they know that the president is paying attention, they're going to make sure their senior leaders are doing everything and it gets pushed down. For an initiative like that, it has continued now into the third administration. So President Trump actually did keep that initiative going, and President Biden has, which shows one of the success points of when an issue is not politically tied, but just is how do you effectively run something and it sticks, that's when you have the culture change. And we started seeing a lot of success really in the middle of the Trump administration. Mostly when I am sure you are aware, President Trump was not a big fan of the civil service and the government. We had a lot of agencies, such as our Environmental Protection Agency, that they were trying to fire everyone and undermining the science. Every single aspect of how the last administration looked at several agencies, the data should have said employee engagement has disappeared. Instead, what we found was in every agency, engagement year after year kept going up. And looking closely at the data, we asked questions about the difference between how do individual employees look at their manager versus how do they look at senior leadership. And we saw there was more than a 20-point gap between how employees looked at their boss versus how they looked at the political leadership. And it was respect for their boss that kept the scores high. And we were able to see that managers during the last, even 4 or 5 years, learned all these new ways of talking to their employees, communicating with them, responding to a lot of the little things that were going wrong. So when things were bad, the employees still were engaged because they had a communication with their boss that didn't exist before. So they clearly disliked the senior leadership, but they were able to see a difference. And I think that's an important thing when you're talking about a civil service should always be looking 10, 20 years into the future. Our job, we're not a public company. Quarterly results don't matter as much because we're always thinking, where does our country need to be in the future? And that was like one example of being able to look to see what is needed. With employee engagement, just as a side note, it's something that other countries were looking at. We stole it from the United Kingdom, where they had already been looking at it. But after we did it, a lot of other countries took our survey. And now there are enough countries doing this that we're able to talk across borders. So one of the things I know, I personally speak with the World Bank a lot, it's comparing our employee engagement, where we'll have meetings where it will be us talking with, Romania and Brazil and Australia, all kind of talking about where we're seeing results. And one of the amazing things, virtually every country doing this has the same exact results in terms of who are the most engaged employees by age. Like we see, no matter which country, when you're about 7 years in, you have some very engaged employees. The least engaged are, that period from like mid 40s to early 50s, where you may have been in the job already 20 years, but you're nowhere close to being able to retire, and you have children at home and aging parents, and you're tired and you're burnt out. And then you see a bump where people who stay past a certain age, they're really happy. So, finding those results when you're looking at civil service, it's important to kind of be looking at, because you can use that data to know that you manage people differently at different times in their careers. You can give different types of performance management. If during a certain periods of careers, most people are going to be in one way, for the people who are kind of in that dip, you start performance managing them by saying, you know what, you may need to work from home more. We're going to give you some flexibility that you can deal with your life a little bit better. For the junior people who may not have that, you performance manage them by trying to give them bonuses, trying to give them exciting assignments. So you're able to really start looking and planning further in the future to always kind of know to treat people differently. The last thing, and again, please stop me if I'm going too long, but this was just what Dan Roger kind of asked me to touch on. What are we working on now? And that is something I think, within Ghana, I think is something that you will be very interested in. And that is, how do we assess people to determine if they can do the job? And the reason I think this is exciting, we're seeing changes all over the world in just the last couple of years that I do believe all governments need to be paying attention to these trends if we want to really be able to make the best hires. For the longest time, we have really said, if you have this college degree, you are qualified to do a job. If you have this number of years of experience, you are qualified to do the job. And that's kind of what we looked at. What we're seeing really changing now, it's having a degree. It does matter in certain jobs. Nobody wants to hire a self-taught like doctor, but there are many other positions where people are able to get the skills because either they naturally have them, or by taking even short courses that, an online course sometimes is enough. Um, the examples that we're seeing coming out now, it's Google during the early days of COVID, were just looking at what jobs were people most looking at. And there were a couple of positions like program management, data scientist, one or two others. They developed courses, like real courses, real assessments, and they were able to charge, I believe it's about $200 to take the class. If someone passed that class for that job, Google said that they would be willing to hire them because they needed these skills too. When Google said, we will hire these people who pass it, a whole lot of other technology companies said, well, good enough for Google, which is the leading tech company, clearly it's going to be good enough for us. In the first year of this program, they found that most of the people who took the course were in the lowest income bracket in the US. And within 6 months of passing the course, virtually every one of them was in a higher paying job. That's a really significant thing to say, that if you're looking to train a workforce, that it doesn't have to involve sending people for 4 years to a traditional university. And being able to say what matters is, can this person do this job? And more in the past couple of years, like at least in the US, the cost of a college education has skyrocketed. So very few people are really able to afford those degrees. Plus, we're all, we will sit and say, if someone has a degree, when you're 22, that's great. Maybe it says something. But if you're 45 and 50 and your degree is 30 years old, does it really mean the same thing anymore if you haven't used it? Versus being able to have an assessment that is looking at what's done. So from a civil service perspective, we have been conducting some pilots that are involving changing the role of HR and the managers, where we are now having the subject matter experts, the people who do the actual work, help write the job description, write up what they're looking for. HR's job is to make sure everything is legal and accurate and following the different laws and different policy. But the first round with resumes, we have our experts read a resume, because an expert can kind of cut through when people are just making things up or using vague words, especially when you're talking about technical work. Like if you're in IT, anyone can drop in a few words, but there's a big difference between knowing the programs. Then we have our experts do just a brief 10-minute interview, standard, with every one of the people whose resumes pass that round. Because often that's all it takes is 10 minutes, usually for an expert to know if someone's lying, to know if they really can do it. If they pass that round, then they have a more full interview. And that's when again, these are all subject matter experts, talking to them, having a conversation, and they can usually say, yeah, this person knows the job. It is only at that point that human resources gets involved. Everyone who got to that point is considered to have passed the test, and they are qualified to do the job. That's when HR does its thing, making sure that, within our system, they have to, be a US citizen. They have to, depending on the job, there are laws about drug use, criminal history, public trust, all of those types of things HR does then. So when the manager is given a list of, here are people who are qualified to do the job, every single person is already going to be proven to be able to do the job. So all the manager is talking is fit and a couple of the other issues. Down the line, the person is able to kind of come on board, and they've already met staff, they've already been vetted. So those staff will be better taken care of by the existing staff. And even further, those subject matter experts who aren't managers, but they've learned one of the key management skills, because they have now had to think about their job of the future. They've had to think about, how do you interview? How do you figure out who's the right person to do the job? So when they later become managers, they're going to be better managers. This is, again, the type of example of it is an incredibly difficult change to make. We are, again, a 2.2 million person workforce spread out not only in every part of the United States and in thousands of professions, but around the world, the different standards. But it starts, you need to start the change at the top. And then by taking that lead, you're able to start pushing it further. So one of the reasons I was lent to the Senate was we needed to change some laws in order to make this happen. And some of it was, my own professional development. Being in one job for 7 years, I was personally burnt out. Not going to pretend the end of the Trump administration was not very exhausting for someone whose main job was protecting a civil service that was under attack. So some of it was, when you talk about, I'm one of those people, mid-40s with kids, aging parents, and burning out. My boss was smart enough to say, take a break, go do harder work, different work, because I'm that type of nerd who that does re-energize me to do different type of work. But it was recognizing sometimes you need to change the law, sometimes you just need to change the culture. For employee engagement, there was not a single law that needed to be changed, not a single regulation. It was all about leading change, figuring out what is necessary. So I'll stop there. I'm willing to take any questions. Just to reiterate, I don't always agree with the official stance. So I will be answering as my nerdy self, as opposed to saying this is what President Biden would, what the official stance of the administration is.
Thanks so much, Rob. That was fascinating. I can relate to many of the aspects because I also work for the government in India, and it was really fascinating to know you about your work and some of the issues which even we face here back in India. The floor is now open to questions. Any one of you, if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Please unmute yourself and ask your questions if you have any. Or you can also put it in the chat box if that's easier for you.
Hello?
Yes, please.
Yeah, please, Hafiz. It's Hafiz.
Yeah, Hafiz, please go ahead. Yeah.
Doc, thank you very much for the enlightenment and the presentation. During your presentation, you made mention of, in terms of the salary, comparing it to the private sector and then the public sector in the US.
Yes.
But realizing that the public sector or the government is able to still get the best persons or professionals to undertake the government work, even though the salary differentials is a bit huge. How do we inculcate that into our local economies in terms of our currency's depreciation effect and those stuff, comparing to get these professionals in the system and also try to be able to manage them and maintain them vis-a-vis them moving to the private sector? Like,
Sure.
what has the US been able to do to maintain them?
So one of the main places I do disagree with our current system is our pay is based on basically they try to compare all jobs and put them into a grade, and now we can pay a little bit differently based on where someone lives, recognizing living in San Francisco is more expensive than living in Kansas. The problem is our pay in most of those jobs is nowhere near competitive enough, from, especially when you're talking what is going to be a lower level job. So like we have government hospitals in cities like San Francisco where working in a hotel, you make more money cleaning a hotel room than you would make cleaning a hospital room. So we are certainly in a bad situation in a lot of places, that we have flexibility to increase pay, but we're never going to be able to increase it to what it really needs to be. Some of it is the political nature of our country, in that politicians don't want to be seen as giving more money to government employees. They don't want to spend. There are many people who believe a lot of what we're doing. So I mentioned our government scientists. We have a lot of our politicians who don't believe there should be government scientists. They're not fans of the CDC. They're not fans of us having national parks and different issues like that. So within that, the best we can try to do is come up with other avenues that make our jobs more appealing. So to use lawyers as an example, if you're in the private sector and you're a lawyer, you may be able to make 4, 5, 6 times as much money as you make in the government. But you also have to spend your time billing your hours in, 6-minute increments, selling business, going and doing a lot of work that I don't think a lot of people really enjoy doing. Whereas when you're a government attorney, you're just working on the law, you're working on the case. You have a quality of life that you may not have. I'll speak from my own experience with one of my closest friends. She was a lawyer in intellectual property, making about $400,000 a year, and hated her life because it was just the constant work. So she came to work for our patent and trade organization, representing the government in patent issues. She makes half the salary, but she has a quality of life that she didn't have before, and she was able to trade that off. For our doctors, same thing. If you're a private doctor in the US, our healthcare system is a shame. It's an awful system. I will not defend it. But most of my personal friends who are doctors at hospitals, they're on call all the time. They have to have a lot of insurance for, malpractice if something goes wrong. They have to be business people as much as they need to be doctors. Whereas if you're a doctor at one of our hospitals, which are usually going to be for veterans, the indigenous population, a few other places like that, you can just focus on the medicine. Like, you work your set hours, and yes, you're making a lot less money. But if what you're passionate about is saving a life and doing research, you get to do that. So that was one of the reasons, like, the employee engagement initiative was such a success. It was about removing the things that just annoyed a lot of people. Like, one of my favorite stories, and it ties to your question with pay on how to make a difference. There was an agency that didn't allow microwaves in their kitchen, like across the entire department. It was something that someone had made a decision long ago. And when that agency first surveyed its employees, saying, like, what could we do? And that came up, the secretary of that agency, so the top ranked person, looked at that and said, our employees aren't allowed to have microwaves? Get microwaves in those offices. You're talking, the department had to spend a few $1,000s, and that made the employees happier. Sometimes it really is that simple little thing. If we're not going to win on salary, we have to win on culture. We have to win on quality of life. I'm personally not a big believer in public service motivation, which is, I know within our field, like the idea that people are drawn to serve because of patriotism. I personally don't really buy into a lot of that, but there is something to say where there are little things like that that make a difference. For my office, they had us all take a picture in front of an American flag for our badges, and our LinkedIn profiles, things like that, cost nothing. But, our parents thought it was pretty cool, those little types of things, being able to, for me, they do like fireworks on the 4th of July here for Independence Day. And during like the Obama administration, they invited staff to the White House lawn to, watch from the lawn, and we were able to bring our kids. For Halloween, we were able to bring our kids to go trick-or-treating. So it's coming up often with a lot of those little things. Like, I'm not saying like bribery type perks, but the reminding people that they're making a difference, and that little change is often very effective. And I think we overlook those aspects. But if you have more say in your pay system, it is worth trying to get closer to market pay. I do not advocate mimicking the US system of pay. It is far better for you to be able to look at what are people getting paid. You don't have to pay the top, because chances are the stability of a government job, the retirement, that is factored into total compensation. So you don't have to pay more than Google, but you certainly have to make sure your people are not miserable in their jobs and dramatically underpaid for good.
Thank you very much, Doc. A follow-up, which is a bit personal, maybe. To you, what's the motivation that's still keeping you there in the midst of all these, should I say, semi-incentives or motivations that personally you would have had other alternatives, but you're still there trying to build up? What's keeping you, which we can learn from, to also, in the midst of the challenges, and then motivate ourselves in where we are?
It's persistence. It's a matter of being able to just constantly change quickly and figuring out how to do things without getting overly stuck in the past on that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, to extend at least.
Okay. And I see there's a question in the chat room. There's a question in the chat room saying, do you experience some pressure from government officials or influential people in HR management? Absolutely. A lot. It is one of the harder aspects, particularly of my job, where the fact that I work for both parties, like whoever the president is, and my job is to make their policies work. Of course, when there is a change of president, they're not going to trust me necessarily at first. It took me a very long time to develop enough of a reputation that I can be trusted, but it is one of the riskier things, and a place where, again, I have a different opinion from the leadership. I firmly believe an independent civil service is what is necessary for a healthy country to be stable long term. Our civil servants, well, there's a certain amount to being responsive and recognizing that we are not the elected officials, and we are representing all of the citizens of the country, and we are representing such a major infrastructure. Like, we can't be separate from the population and the election results, there are very few things that should ever change with the president when it comes to human resources. And the true risk of civil servants being loyal to a president or a party, it is the difference between a democracy and being in an autocratic dictatorship. Our law enforcement in particular, as I'm sure your law enforcement, they're authorized to take lives. If your civil servants, your police officers see a crime, they are allowed to kill the person. If all of a sudden it turns to they are allowed to kill someone on a president's order, they're no longer law enforcement, but you're in a situation where they're death squads. So I know that's a big jump when you're talking about it, that the possibility that happens, but the pressure from government officials on HR management to try to put the people that they want in place, change some of those rules, it gets very, very dangerous. If you're looking to do a little research at the end of the Trump administration, they tried to pass a policy that would have required anyone who is in a policy position, implementing the law, basically any sort of role would be answerable to the president. And that included law enforcement, attorneys, inspectors, and had the Trump administration had a second term, that was exactly what would have happened to the US civil servant. So we were that close. When it comes to, and I see your follow-up about hiring and promotions, it happens more at the higher levels that there will be pressure on, since limited number of senior positions. Yes, it will come into play, but that's where having everything has to be documented. It makes it a little bit harder to have that pressure. For our senior most executives, the 7,000 or so career leaders, the Office of Personnel Management is supposed to have a panel of people review those hires to make sure that it's, in a lot of cases, it's not just someone being put in. And then we also have some laws related to whether a political appointee is allowed to stay in the government in a career position. It's called burrowing in, where the political appointee may try to get a permanent position. And there's a review process to make sure that that person really is the best qualified. It's a real job and it wasn't something just created. It's not easy, but it is something that's where having the law behind us does help. So the law in many places makes things more difficult in a bad way. In other ways, it provides protection for an HR specialist to try to say no. Okay. Do politicians influence recruitment of applicants into the service? Not directly. So we have a certain number of political appointees that serve at the pleasure of the president. The number has increased a lot. Again, it's something that I think we should be limiting. Those people, there's no qualifications for them other than the president's people picked them. But when it comes to the 2.2 million permanent jobs, they can tell people to recruit, but the process is still going to be, you have to apply, it has to be shown. And so I'm sure there are cases it happens, it's just a lot harder for them to be hired. But I actually would like our politicians encouraging more people to come into public service. Okay. So training is one of the biggest weaknesses of our civil service. It's often the first budget item that gets cut, and there's very little compulsory training, and usually it's kind of simple stuff like they passed a law years ago about cybersecurity, and every year we all have to take a test saying, no, we are not, giving out our passwords. We are not going to just click this link. And so there's very little training. It's a place that the government needs to invest far more time and effort into doing it. We, in the past, in so many jobs, really were just doing the same job over and over. The people didn't invest in training. Now, when the jobs are changing so often, we should want to be reskilling our workforce on a regular basis, but we're not there yet. Okay. Do we have a central office managing all HR facilities? So we have an Office of Personnel Management that sets the regulations. They are responsible for certain things that are centralized, like our retirement system, our health insurance system, since again, our health insurance is done through the employer, not universal as in your country. They are supposed to be studying topics, but they really haven't done that. So we have a few other small offices that do studies. So we have a small agency called the Merit System Protection Board, which just looks at the system itself. We have the Government Accountability Office that will issue different studies, but our central personnel office has not particularly been doing that. They have the data, but the data is in really, really bad shape. It's open to the public, but it uses technology from the 1990s, and it is very difficult to use. You have to use Microsoft Explorer, and Microsoft Explorer doesn't exist anymore here. That kind of shows how old it is. So it should be done, but it's not. Okay. How do you check performance of a staff within a year? So we do have a law that every single employee needs to have a mid-year like performance check-in, and then an end-of-year performance evaluation. Within the US, I think almost everyone will say it's a joke. Everyone kind of gets above average because there's no real, we don't get bonuses particularly. The performance doesn't really lead to promotions. So in terms of making people happy, generally most people just get a positive performance review, or it's used to address a few features, but they run reports, they can show who has it, who doesn't have it. It's kind of a paper exercise. In terms of job security, which is the next question, that's one of the main reasons people still want to come to the government. It's a secure job that, by and large, like our Department of Defense has 800,000 people alone. Our country, the chances of the US ever taking a position of us decreasing our security forces, it's generally not going to happen. It is very difficult to get fired. It's a problem, actually, how difficult it is to get fired. And there is a movement to change job security, to stop making it that you're hired with the thought that you're going to be working for us for 40 years, since there are very few jobs that do that. And some agencies are requesting what they're calling like 10-year positions, where you get hired for up to 10 years. And then if the mission changes, you can get rehired for a different job. But that is not there yet. We have strong federal labor unions who will fight that very hard, but then we also have agencies. So like NASA is the one that's leading this change. They will point out that they have the most brilliant like rocket scientists in the world for rockets that are only in museums now. And so that is an issue in real time being discussed. So civil servants who are underperforming is a huge weakness. So when I mentioned our employee engagement survey, the lowest response, lowest every single year of the survey, is whether management will address a poor performer who cannot and will not improve. But this is the downside of our strong labor unions, that they will defend a poor performer, and the burden on removing one is incredibly difficult. Managers will try to provide them with training. They will often try to move them into a different job, but I will say we are certainly not a model of how do we address poor performers. There's some effort to, and I've seen in other places, the way that they've addressed poor performance is, instead of the like once a year bad performance appraisal, it's the manager talks to an employee for 5 or 10 minutes every week, every other week, checking in, documenting, and then the manager is kind of able to sit and say, wow, I've spoken to you 26 times, and on 10 of those times I've had to say you did something wrong. We need to start having these conversations. I'm not sure how much that is really happening, but it would be the way I would recommend that a manager schedules a 5-10 minute conversation and writes it down and keeps track of everything. But it is definitely an issue. Okay. Let me just read this next question. Okay, so yes, our top leaders are all political leaders. So they all have to resign when the president changes. So those are your equivalent of ministers. What would be considered our chief directors would be our senior executive service. They're the ones who are supposed to be in charge during a transition. There is less movement of them. And that's where a lot of our stability comes from, that when a political appointee resigns, during that period, the career chief directors are in place. Now, this was another thing in the last administration. They were trying to change that. It was stopped at the last minute, but the political appointees wanted to be able to remove any senior executive service person. And the way they were going to do it was, you may be a senior executive in charge at the Department of Agriculture. Well, we're just going to move you to be, responsible for HR in the Treasury Department. Like, they wanted to move people to get them to quit. That was stopped. I would expect that situation will come back again in the future, where there's a little bit more pressure at that top level will be if someone leaves on their own, who is hired to replace them. So the political interference is there. It's probably not as, as direct, but you're also in a smaller country with a smaller workforce. It's a little bit easier, I think, to have that level. So that's where us passing the law, the merit system principles and prohibited personnel practices, that does help us. We also have what are called whistleblower laws, that any government official, if they see something like that that's illegal, they're able to go either to Congress and report it or to this agency that will investigate. But it's still at great personal risk that people do that. Okay. What is the role? So administrative law judges have actually a fairly small role within the civil service. So most of our administrative law judges deal with very specific topics. So we have administrative law judges that hear immigration cases, like individual immigration cases. For our Social Security system, for if people with this, if they want to claim they have a disability and be led into Social Security earlier, we have administrative law judges that handle those cases. Within the civil service, all of them are based at that Merit System Protection Board. So that's if a civil servant believes his or her rights have been violated, so if they've already been disciplined, they can go to those administrative law judges and say, I was unfairly disciplined, have a case heard. So it doesn't go to our main court system, it goes to those specialists. So they're there, but it's, we're not talking a very large role. Do you retire on your salary? No. So if you're eligible to retire as a civil servant, we have a small pension that you get where, like, I can leave government today, and then when I'm sometime in my mid to late 60s, I will get a certain amount each month, not enough to live on. And then they give us we have retirement plans, like, in the private sector, they're called 401k plans in the US. But we have a government run one called the Thrift Savings Board, where it's market based. So you have to invest in it. You have to put your own salary in. The government gives a couple of % of your salary into it. But if I'm not investing in that, I'm not going to get anything on it. We don't have the greatest retirement system either, but the federal government is one of the few places in America left that you can still get any sort of like pension, and you're not completely dependent on were you able to put money away for retirement. Okay, how did the U.S. Civil Service adapt at the peak and post COVID-19? That's a great question. Our country actually, I think, did a tremendous job of transitioning to having people telework and shifting services to people not working in their offices pretty quickly. That when we have agencies such as like our Social Security Administration, where people came into offices, spoke day to day, they shut all of those offices down. Everyone learned to work from home on their phones, on their computers, and you have not read cases of people not being able to get their benefits. For a lot of other jobs, it really was a matter of people figuring out quickly how to get the job done. Now, we have a lot of jobs that people had to go to work. So when you're looking at people who work like in flight control towers, prison guards, doctors, like they had to be on site, but we worked to try to add as many layers of safety as we could in that. We did lose, several hundred civil servants died of COVID that they got on the job. A lot of our first responders, a lot of people in our hospitals. But I think the government actually did a really good job of making sure the mission of government was still getting done. Where we are now is far more problematic in trying to figure out, well, what do we do next? Because we've now shown for 2 years, like I'm working in my kitchen right now. I used to have a job where I had to be in my office reachable. Well, I'm still reachable all the time, but no, I never thought my job can be done from my kitchen table. And now after 2 years, there's a certain amount of who goes back? Do we need people to go back in? And that is going to be a far harder question to answer. And it has not been decided yet. That's something I think over the next 3 to 5 months will probably be the biggest thing that is being examined.
There is a question from Maxine, I believe. Maxine, your hand is raised. Would you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure.
Okay, so thank you, Doc. My question is on the employee engagement.
Yes.
I'm just looking at, the way we, the civil servants, we operate here. And because, being able to have, because the employee engagement is more of an HR function. And I believe it's more talking of how motivated a staff is at a point in his or her, her career on the job that he or she is doing. So I'm just wondering the type of civil service we operate here, will it be really feasible to have this HR function operating efficiently? Because our job is such a way that you become a master of what you do. And so I'm just trying to see how we, the civil service, this employee engagement can really work well, because truly be told, a lot of people are not motivated, especially with doing the same kind of job each and every time. But I don't know how it's going to be feasible looking at the system that we run here. So I don't know how you can help us to get.
So that's a really good question. Human resources at the core, we work with people. Like, it's as simple as that. Like, our job are dealing with people. So the processes, the human resources, the paperwork, all of that is just a way of dealing with the people. But why HR is a good place to focus on engagement, it's fundamentally, we need to figure out how to work with all different people. So from HR, you're working with the applicant who doesn't know anything to the manager who knows the weeds of the jobs and has to figure everything out. So we're already consultants who have to be able to speak with everyone on every type of job. One of the places that, if you want to start within your own shop, is probably the best way on how do you make the job more appealing to your own employees. So some of what I've seen, our own, so the head of HR in each of our agencies, they're called the Chief Human Capital Officer, that they're responsible for their department. And one of our best examples was at the USAID, so Internet Aid for International Development, obviously a large presence in Africa. As recently as a few years ago, they had the least engaged staff, and their HR department was considered about the worst in all of government. Like, it was that bad. And some of it was the structure of the actual shop. They had a new head of HR come in, and the first thing he did was looked at the culture of his own shop, and he found he had some bullies. He had some toxic, bad employees. And as a manager, the first thing he did was he did all of that hard work to remove the bullies and the people who really, like, those 3 or 4 employees were causing so much damage to the rest of the staff, that he showed that he was going to improve how he worked with his own staff. But then he invested, it was only a little money, into artificial intelligence, like bots, like these little things where we have so much paperwork that they spent a lot of their time dealing with that. So by buying this off-the-shelf technology where, like, for example, if someone changes their name, they get married, they change their name, it used to be 7 different forms that needed to be filled out, and HR had to spend a lot of time dealing with the employee, doing it, filling it out, filing it. By adding this one little technology thing, the person types in their name one place, it goes to all 7 forms, it's all online. The HR person doesn't have to spend any time doing that. They also invested in looking at what are the questions that HR got the most, and they wrote it out. So employees who had a question, instead of calling HR and HR having to answer the same question, 15 times a day, the person was able to easily find it online, which sounds simple. But when I say this had one of the worst HR departments, they had never done that before. So by taking away some of those bad tasks, HR was able to spend more time on the interesting work. So there's always going to be the typing, the administrative, that type of work to be done. But for engagement, it was by him starting with his own shop that then filtered to the rest of the department. So for their employees, where again, if you have, they're based in Washington, D.C., and you have people, their employees who are based in time zones 12, 13 hours away, they used to not be able to get their questions answered because they were never on the same, they were never working at the same hours as their HR specialist. Figuring out ways to make that easier made their employees happier, more engaged. They were able to focus on other things. So HR really is the best place to start the engagement efforts, and then you're proving the concept for everyone else. Okay. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Hello.
So the U.S. The question on
Hello?
the U.S. has. Oh, sorry. Go.
Yeah. What of a system where you realize that the system has been politicized in a way? What should be the role of the HR?
So I think the role of HR, it's one part of it will always have to be just making sure everything is technically accurate. You need to make sure, the paperwork is done, making sure they're able to facilitate getting the mission done. HR's job is to make sure that the government is hiring the right people, performance managing them correctly, compensating them correctly. When we're doing our job correctly, then the agency, the manager is doing the frontline work, whether it's defense, security, education, they're able to focus on doing their jobs. We don't want someone who is trying to think, how do you keep the electricity going in the country? They shouldn't have to be thinking about any of this paperwork. So we need to be the ones freeing them up to focus on their technical expertise. We should be responsive when it comes to, as you pointed out, the political pressure, and we need to be able to stand strong against that and respected and trusted. But if we don't do our jobs right in HR, every other thing fails. It doesn't matter if you have the best computers, the best weapons, the best buildings. If you don't have the right people in the jobs, everything fails. So you can have those great computers. If you don't have people who know how to do IT, it's all for waste. So our job is to make sure everyone else has what they need. It really is that simple. If we fail, everyone fails. And I don't believe HR is supposed to be the no shop. I don't believe we should all be doing a ton of operations work. Within our civil service, we still have a lot of people who make really bad, stupid errors that they don't get the trust of their managers. Misspelling people's name when they hire them, paying them wrong, losing paperwork. that's not acceptable. So that part needs to be done. But really, we're there to figure out what do they need to get their jobs done. How do we figure out, as I mentioned with engagement, with the performance management, a manager is not going to know the research to know how to treat someone at 25, 35, 55, and figuring out how do you work with people in the different ways. It's figuring out what are the benefits that should be offered. So it's meeting people where they are, and that's for us to figure out. It's not up for our scientists to figure out what they need to be paying their employees and what are the benefits their employees should have. They need to figure out whatever their research is that they're doing.
Hello again. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I wonder whether you've had the opportunity to take a look at the organizational structure of the Ghana Civil Service and vis-a-vis yours, so that you can give us some idea on ours, looking at yours and ours. So I wonder whether we have taken a look at our organizational structure before, because typically we had a 4-line directory. We have the HR, research, statistics, information management, and other ones. Those are the 4 are the key ones. But in some exceptions, some ministries, they have more than the 4. So I don't know whether we have taken a look at our organizational structure before.
I have not looked at your system before, so I'm not quite sure a good answer on that. I know within ours, our HR system, even in my 20 years, has changed from, we used to have HR basically in every city, every office, really working in the local areas. And now it's been centralized to, each agency has a few offices, maybe in the country, some may even only have one. So that is generally more based on, I think, the size. Again, when you're talking like our Department of Defense with 800,000 people, it's a lot of HR, it's a lot of different departments. It really is just a different scale and structure, so it's hard to compare to. And just quickly looking in the chats, so our civil service, again, well, we have the Office of Personnel Management. It does not run things. Each agency has a lot of HR on its own. So they do the hiring, they do the performance management. Our Office of Personnel Management just is responsible for the rules of the system. In terms of occasions to reduce the size, it comes up every single year about whether we should reduce the size of our government. And then when it comes down to saying, well, what do you want to actually eliminate? Then no one wants to eliminate anything. So back on the Trump administration, when they came in, they initially said that they wanted to be able to eliminate hundreds of thousands of our positions, but we were not allowed to touch defense, homeland security, or veterans issues. And once you remove them, there's not a lot of government left. So we're 2.2 million people, but just between those 3 agencies, that's 1.4 million of them. And that's not counting like the Department of Justice, and no one actually wants our food not to be inspected. So it will always come up, but the reality is our country has close to 400 million people. We still serve a worldwide role. So I mentioned like USAID, that's tens of thousands of people that most other countries don't have an equivalent of USAID. Our State Department, we have people in every single country in the world. For most of our programs, there's room to change, but not cut. Where the difference has been, it really isn't a job people are doing. So for us, again, our tax system, incredibly complicated, people being able, pre-computers. We had our Internal Revenue Service was filled with people who printed the papers, warehouses, people who mailed out the forms, people who opened the mail, people who looked at your tax returns, entered the data in, wrote a check, mailed it out. It was about 100,000 people doing that. Those jobs have all disappeared because with computers, you don't need the paper. You don't need to do any of that. But our tax code is complex enough that those people have been replaced with forensic accountants and customer service people who can talk on the phone and be able to do a lot of that stuff. So the jobs change, but it would be really difficult for us to cut without really giving up functions that people are not willing to give up. Then what countries does the US look to is for reform civil service? The UK. We do work closely. The UK has been a really good laboratory for changes. Canada also has been far more advanced, but this kind of the sad reality, there really aren't too many countries that are very advanced that deal with the complexity that we deal with. Like I've had great conversations with Estonia, but it's a small country that it's a smaller platform. We do spend time talking again with our colleagues at the Bureaucracy Lab and the World Bank. We're active with the OECD, where OECD has a public sector like HR practice where every May they have a couple of day meeting, and sometimes we would go in person, otherwise listen in. But there are not a lot of great answers on who to look to. One of my jokes is we talk about love being the international language. It's not. It's figuring out civil service. Every country is stuck at the same place. Okay. Let me just read this next one. So people can transfer from one department to another, but they have to apply for the job. So it's not like an automatic thing. You do have to apply. You can do it. What's nice about it, it's like I've worked at a few different agencies, but nothing ever changes with my health benefits, my retirements, all of that transfers with me. But each time that I'm going to a different job, I have to apply for it. Some jobs are only open to current government employees. That's the benefit, where sometimes they're open to the public. Other times, they're really looking for people who have experience in government work. Yeah, I think I caught up on the chats.
Yeah, I think there is one more question. Rob, I'm not sure. I know that you had to leave earlier, or you have some other commitment. So I'm not sure if it's already late, but if not, maybe this can be the last question.
Sure. Has there been a situation where workers complain about their salary? Every day. It is, on the plus side, all of our salaries are public. You can go online and see not just by position and location, but often our salaries are out there. So it's pretty easy to do all that. So we have a lot of positions that we underpay. We have some positions we overpay, but everyone knows what they're going to get paid. So there are complaints, but you know what you're getting when you sign up. It's not like in the private sector where nobody knows what to expect. And it really is, people are always going to complain about their salary. It's just we have the fact that it is so public, you know, it's a little bit harder to sit and say, hey, why am I getting paid more or less than this other person, when it's like, well, everything is public. You know, it's so it takes some of it away. Where the complaints are often is you don't really can get bonuses. There's no real incentive or reward for the best employees. So I think we see a lot more on that front, where especially those who are really good at their job, those who are senior at the job, it's kind of hard to tell them, could you do more when we're not going to pay you anymore. Okay, so we have two different groups at the top. The senior executive service, they are career employees. They're there all the time, and they have to apply for their jobs. They have to be approved to be in the senior executive service by the Office of Personnel Management, and they are there. They are the career leadership. The political leadership, they are called in our terms Schedule C employees. Those are the thousands of people who come and go with the president and serve at the pleasure of the president. So those are the senior most ministers, but also a lot of people who work in like the press office, talking to the media. It would include a lot of entry-level people. Like the senior people have confidential assistants. Those are often like 22, 23-year-olds who, they're political appointees who are there just to answer the phones because they don't want to have a career person doing it. So the senior executive service, think of, are just the top career employees. It's only about an 8,000 person across government. And depending on the agency, they may be overseeing thousands upon thousands of employees and issues. Within, like, the way our Department of Defense, our military looks at it, the generals look at the SES as their equals, if that helps. So, the idea is it's the very top. So a senior executive service member should be like a general and admiral, the top in the military, but the top on the career ranks. And as far as are civil servants allowed to do other businesses? Yes, but that second part of your statement with conflict with the duties, you are not allowed to do it while you're working. You are prohibited, like it is illegal to use your current position to try to gain business. Like I cannot charge you for my time. Like I can't go and say to the World Bank, sure, I'm willing to do the session, but you need to pay me to do it. I can't, while I'm on this call, say, I'm selling cookies, please buy them. You're not. So if you want to do something on the side, you are allowed to do it, but really strict rules of not using your position to do it. And when it comes to politics, we are not allowed to run for a political office as a Republican or a Democrat. The only type, like we can volunteer, and you can run for, like we have some positions that like local government, they don't care about your party. You're allowed to do that, but we have very strict rules. And I'm never allowed to, like on my social media, I can't ever take a position for a candidate, for a party, anything along those lines. So side business, it's okay. I work with someone who sells scarves and, on the side. So you can do that.
Thank you so much, Rob, for your time and in fact for staying longer and answering all the questions. It was great to have you with us today, and thanks a lot again for the fascinating talk.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Okay, have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you very much.
I hope you all liked the session today and found it
Very
very
insightful.
useful.
Yes, we enjoyed